You're spending hours every week fighting weeds, watering plants, and watching your garden struggle while Japanese farmers are growing massive vegetables in soil they have untouched in decades, and this isn't luck. This is the result of a method called do-nothing farming that Masanobu Fukuoka developed over 40 years, proving that less work produces better results than our exhausting Western approach. But almost nobody outside Japan knows about this because we've been taught that gardening requires constant intervention, tilling, fertilizing, weeding, pest control, when the truth is that nature has been growing abundant plants for millions of years without any human help. And Fukuoka's method simply removes the obstacles we keep creating. Here's what happened when I stopped fighting my garden and started working with it instead. The philosophy that changes everything. The fundamental insight that modern agriculture has forgotten is that nature doesn't need us. Walk into any forest and you'll see plants thriving without tilling, without fertilizer, without pesticides, and without human intervention. The soil is rich, the plants are healthy, and the ecosystem regulates itself perfectly. Fukuoka's question was simple but revolutionary. What if we stopped doing all the things we think are necessary and let nature do the work? He called it do-nothing farming, but that's misleading. It's not about doing nothing. It's about doing less of the wrong things and more of the right things. The method has four core principles that contradict everything conventional gardening teaches. No tilling or plowing, no chemical fertilizers or compost. No weeding by cultivation or herbicides, no pesticides. And somehow, this produces better results than the intensive methods that exhaust gardeners and deplete soil. What I changed in my garden: I started with a 200 square foot plot that I'd been gardening conventionally for 3 years. Every spring, I tilled the soil. Every week, I pulled weeds. I added compost and fertilizer. I sprayed for pests. And my results were mediocre weak plants, constant pest problems, and soil that got harder to work every year. The first change was the hardest because it felt like giving up control. I stopped tilling completely, and Fukuoka was adamant about this. He said that plowing the soil is the fundamental cause of most gardening problems, because it destroys soil structure, kills beneficial organisms, brings weed seeds to the surface, and creates compaction over time. Instead of tilling, I used what Fukuoka called natural cultivation. I simply pushed aside the surface vegetation, scattered seeds, and covered them with a thin layer of straw. No digging, no soil disturbance, just minimal intervention. The second change was seed balls. Fukuoka developed this technique for direct seeding without tilling. You mix seeds with clay and compost, roll them into small balls, and scatter them on the surface. The clay protects seeds from birds and insects. The compost provides initial nutrients. And when rain comes, the balls dissolve and seeds germinate exactly where they land. I made seed balls with radish, carrot, and lettuce seeds. It felt absurd just throwing balls of clay onto my garden and walking away. But Fukuoka insisted this was how nature plants seeds, through random dispersal, not careful rows. The permanent mulch system. The third change was constant mulch cover, and this is where the magic happens. Fukuoka said the soil surface should never be bare because bare soil dries out, erodes, loses nutrients, and invites weeds. Instead, maintain a permanent layer of organic material that mimics the forest floor. I covered my entire garden with 4 inches of straw, not as a temporary mulch that I'd remove, but as a permanent living layer that would decompose slowly while protecting the soil. And I added more straw every few months as the bottom layer broke down. This permanent mulch does everything we try to accomplish with tilling and weeding. It suppresses weeds by blocking light. It retains moisture so plants need less water. It moderates soil temperature. It feeds soil organisms as it decomposes. And it creates the perfect environment for earthworms and beneficial bacteria that conventional tilling destroys. Within 2 months, I noticed something incredible. The soil under the mulch was soft, dark, and full of earthworms even though I hadn't touched it. The earthworms were doing the tilling naturally, creating channels for air and water while producing perfect fertilizer. the plant communities that balance themselves. The fourth change was companion planting, but not the way most gardeners practice it. Instead of carefully planning which plants go together, I followed Fukuoka's approach of creating diverse plant communities that balance themselves. I scattered white clover seeds throughout the garden to create a living ground cover that fixes nitrogen from the air and shades out weeds. I planted vegetables in clusters rather than rows, mimicking how plants grow in nature, and I allowed some plants to self-seed and spread naturally. The conventional gardener in me panicked when I saw clover growing between my vegetables. But Fukuoka said this is beneficial because the clover feeds the soil while the vegetables feed you. The two plants coexist without competition if you choose the right varieties. What happened in the first 2 months? The first month was terrifying. My garden looked like chaos compared to the neat rows my neighbors maintained. The mulch was thick, clover was spreading. Plants were growing wherever seeds had landed. It looked like I'd abandoned my garden. My neighbors definitely thought I'd lost my mind. One asked if I was letting it go back to nature. Another offered to lend me his tiller because he assumed my equipment had broken. I tried explaining Fukuoka's method, but the looks I got suggested they thought I was making excuses for laziness. But by the second month, something shifted. The vegetables under the mulch were growing faster than anything I'd grown before. The soil stayed moist even during a 2-week drought, and weeds barely appeared because the mulch and clover blocked their germination. My neighbors started asking questions. My tomatoes were larger and healthier than theirs. My lettuce was thriving in summer heat that usually kills it. And I was spending maybe 30 minutes per week on the entire garden while they were spending hours pulling weeds and fighting pests. The soil transformation. This soil transformation was the most dramatic. After just 1 season without tilling, the top 6 inches were darker, softer, and full of life compared to the compacted, pale soil I'd created through years of conventional gardening. I did a simple test. I took a handful of soil from my garden and a handful from my neighbor's tilled garden. Mine was dark brown, almost black, and held together when squeezed but crumbled easily. It smelled rich and earthy. His was like brown, fell apart immediately, and had almost no smell. When I dug down 12 inches in my garden, I found earthworms at every level. The conventional wisdom says 10 earthworms per square foot is good. I was finding 30 to 40. And they were fat, healthy worms, not the thin, stressed worms you find in depleted soil. The mistakes I made, the biggest mistake was not mulching heavily enough at the start. Fukuoka said to use a thick layer, and I thought 2 inches was sufficient. It wasn't. Weeds broke through, and I had to add more straw to suppress them. Once I went to 4 inches, the weed pressure dropped dramatically. The second mistake was impatience. I kept wanting to intervene, pull a weed here, adjust spacing there, add fertilizer when plants looked pale. But Fukuoka's method requires trust that the system will balance itself. Every time I intervened, I disrupted the natural processes that were developing. The third mistake was using the wrong seeds. Fukuoka emphasized using hardy, open-pollinated varieties that can thrive without pampering. I initially planted hybrid vegetables that needed perfect conditions, and they struggled. When I switched to traditional varieties, everything improved. The economics of doing less. Here's what the numbers looked like. In my conventional garden, I spent roughly $200 per year on inputs: fertilizer, compost, seeds, pest control, and tools for cultivation. I spent approximately 4 hours per week maintaining it, and my yields were moderate. In the Fukuoka system, I spent $50 on straw for mulch and $20 on seeds. That's it. I spent maybe 30 minutes per week on maintenance, mostly harvesting. And my yields in year 1 matched my conventional garden despite doing far less work. But the real economic shift happened in year 2. Because the system is self-sustaining, my inputs dropped to almost zero. The mulch from year 1 had partially decomposed, so I only needed to add a thin layer. Plants self-seeded, so I bought fewer seeds. And the soil was so healthy that everything grew vigorously without fertilizer. What this method actually requires, Fukuoka's do-nothing farming, is a misleading name because it actually requires deep observation and timing. You're not doing nothing, you're doing different things at different times. You're observing which plants thrive in which locations and allowing them to self-seed there. You're watching soil moisture and adding mulch when needed. You're noticing beneficial insects and protecting them. You're learning to distinguish between plants that help the system and weeds that harm it. This is harder than following a conventional gardening calendar because it requires understanding your specific ecosystem rather than applying universal rules. But once you develop that understanding, the garden practically runs itself. The transformation that compounds by the end of year 2, my garden was unrecognizable. The soil was darker and deeper than when I started. Earthworms were everywhere. Beneficial insects had established populations. And plants were volunteering in perfect locations without any planning from me. The clover ground cover had spread to fill every gap between vegetables, creating a living mulch that fixed nitrogen while suppressing weeds. The permanent straw layer had decomposed into rich humus that fed the next generation of plants. And the lack of tilling had allowed beneficial fungi to establish networks that transported nutrients to plant roots. This is what Fukuoka meant when he said nature does the work, you stop interfering. The garden had become a self-regulating ecosystem that required minimal input while producing abundant food. Why this works when conventional methods fail? The fundamental difference is that conventional gardening fights nature while Fukuoka's method works with it. Every time you till soil, you destroy the structure that took years to build. Every time you apply synthetic fertilizer, you kill the microorganisms that would create fertility naturally. Every time you remove all weeds, you create bare soil that invites more weeds. Fukuoka's approach recognizes that soil is alive and that living systems organize themselves when given the right conditions. You don't need to impose order through constant intervention. You need to create conditions where beneficial organisms thrive, and they'll do the work of building fertility, suppressing pests, and growing healthy plants. How to start this in your garden? The transition is simple but requires patience. Stop tilling immediately because every pass of the tiller sets you back months in soil recovery. Cover your entire garden with 4 inches of straw or other organic mulch. Plant white clover between your vegetables to create living ground cover. Use seed balls or minimal soil disturbance for planting. Most importantly, resist the urge to intervene. When you see a weed, observe whether it's actually causing problems before pulling it. When plants look stressed, check soil moisture and mulch coverage before adding fertilizer. Trust that the system is developing even when it looks chaotic. The result after 3 years, I'm now in year 3 of this method, and the garden requires almost no maintenance. I add a thin layer of mulch twice per year, I harvest continuously, and I occasionally scatter seeds in gaps. That's it. The soil is so alive that I can push my finger into it effortlessly. Vegetables grow twice as fast as they did under conventional management. Pest problems are minimal because beneficial insects maintain balance. And I haven't bought fertilizer in 2 years. This is what Fukuoka promised your garden that becomes more productive over time while requiring less work. Not through technology or expensive inputs, but through understanding and working with natural processes. The Japanese lazy gardening method isn't about being lazy. It's about being smart enough to let nature do what it does best while you focus on observation and minimal intervention. And once you see it work, you'll never garden the same way again.